Welcome back, climbers. I'm your co-host, Kaylee Floyd, and this is another episode of Climbing Mount CMMC. In this week's episode, Bobby and Adam are joined by Wes Spencer, the co-founder of Empath. They're going to be talking about the concerns and worries that vendors might have while tackling CMMC. So, without further ado, let's get into today's episode.
Okay, everybody, we are super excited to have Wes Spencer, the legend. All of you know who this guy is. Now, traditionally, Wes doesn't really communicate a lot about CMMC, and you know that's a lot what we cover. But we wanted to have, Mr. Spencer come on our show and talk about what the fears that vendors might have about CMMC, the concerns they've got. So, Wes, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yep. Bobby, thank you. Adam, thank you. This is going to be a super fun conversation. When you told me about this, I'm like, I can't wait to talk about this because it is something I think a lot of vendors are afraid to speak on. And so happy to give some thoughts here.
Well, there's a bit of a stigma, I guess, maybe revolving around CMMC, perhaps about the security posture, the cost, those types of things. When you hear CMMC, Wes, what's the first thing that comes to your mind as a vendor? Or maybe, how do you feel about that?
Sure. So just caveat, I'm not speaking for all vendors, clearly, but I think I do represent the mindset of pretty much most vendors if they were to be like totally in a safe space where they feel like they could talk honestly. Vendors are looking through the same lens that an MSP is looking through, which is, are the operations and things in front of me going to lead to profit, right? Like that's at the end of the day, no one should be faulted. This is capitalism here at work. And so we're all thinking through that. And so two things I think come to the vendor's mind when they hear CMMC. One is there some compelling reason that I need to do this? Am I going to either make more money by doing this, or am I going to be able to save and keep MSPs and their clients by doing this? So is it an offensive thing or a defensive thing? But let's be honest, the other thing, and we'll unpack this today too, is they're scared of it because people are running around with all these terms like DFARS and C3PAO and, POAMs and like, I don't know what any of that stuff means. I don't want to know. I already know enough acronyms. My brain's full. Come on, guys, really?
Right.
And so they get scared by it and they get intimidated by it. And I think also, and I want to unpack this today too, there's a lot of folks that are coming in that are saying a whole bunch of things. And then it seems like there's some shifting ground over the past few years.
Right.
And so they kind of look at this like, well, who's the real expert here? Is this just some MSP that heard something from somebody else that maybe was speaking to puff themselves up at a conference, and then now they're parroting this back at me? And so there's a little bit of like believability and credibility that comes into this that the vendors are not sure of either, Bobby.
Yeah, that is so true, Wes. Adam, from your perspective, what are things that as an MSP, since you're sort of representing the MSP side for us as Axiom and MSPs as a whole, what are things that you feel that you get concerned as an MSP when you start thinking about CMMC and working with vendors?
So I think initially just about that third-party risk involved with that. We see time and time again in the news of a third party that gets compromised that leads to a direct incident to an MSP or our client base, which is scary to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
But now if I've got a vendor that doesn't meet their compliance obligations, they could be a risk to my own compliance posture. And when those assessment times come up, is that vendor going to be the reason that I fail? And that's a terrifying thought when you look at all the money on the line.
So Wes, you mentioned, we live in a capitalistic state, country, and so all of that comes with it. When you're dealing with, as a vendor, trying to decide on whether you would want to adopt, what are some things that you think would encourage vendors to want to participate in that ecosystem? What are some clarities you think that they would want to see?
Yeah, we've actually, Bobby, you and I have had a great conversation about this, and I personally love your approach, which is why I was so excited to get on this podcast and chat with you, because I think vendors they can be persuaded, good vendors anyway, they can be persuaded that this matters and CMMC is something that I should care about, but it has to come in the guise of a conversation that is approachable to them and gives them the understanding of what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done. I've heard from a lot of vendors, that have said, you know what? I hear different things from other people. I hear different opinions. I even hear different time frames of when the rulemaking is going to come out. I even hear different things around what level of engagement do I as a vendor in the MSP ecosystem have to adhere to. I'll go so far as to say this, Adam. Bobby. Well,
Yeah.
I guess both of you.
Yeah, both. Yeah.
I think most vendors probably couldn't even tell you what CUI, controlled unclassified information, even is.
Right, right.
If they can't tell you what it is, then how do they even know if any of this matters to you, to your client, to themselves? Like I think we're at a point right now where like there's still so much muddy water from the vendor perspective that the vendors need to be educated by somebody who can legitimately, honestly put their arm around them and say, here's what matters, and an explain like I'm five manner. Here's what you should do to assess yourself and see where you stand. And then here's realistically kind of where we're at in this journey.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes we security people can get so, we can push through fear, through FUD so hard that just like our clients like step back and say, you've scared me too much. You're the boy who cried wolf. We're done in this relationship. I lack trust. I think vendors are that way to a lot of CMMC folks that are out there. And I have nobody specific in mind. So please, anyone listening, don't think I'm pointing my finger at you. I'm not. Of like, they just like, we're done with this until someone forces me and tells me exactly 1, 2, and 3 what to do. I'm not taking that next step because I don't get it. And I feel like everyone's coming after me and I just don't see I don't see the forest through the trees here.
Well, for vendors, right now, you know, I think you probably are more dialed in than any of us in the industry. Would you say that security-based vendors and other organizations that are cloud-based are doing pretty well in the ecosystem? Would you agree?
Define what you mean by pretty well.
They're having growth. They're having profitability. You know,
sure.
in kind of in the lane that they're in currently. And if that's the case, then what is going to help them want to expand their lane to include CMMC and kind of help them participate in that ecosystem?
Let's have an honest conversation about this. So I feel like I can say this now that I'm not. So Empath is certainly a security vendor, but we're really focused on education and upskill for MSPs. I'm not creating a security platform. So I can speak of this freely, I feel like. Most security startups, and I might even go so far as to say even some of the big boys that are in our industry, have never had to care about security for a whole bunch of reasons. And it's one of those things like, you know, the cobbler's kids have the worst shoes, the dentist's kids have the worst teeth. It's like, well, as a security startup, I'm focusing on doing this. Let's just throw EDR out there. I'm focusing on making a great EDR that's absolutely going to detect threats. It's absolutely going to look into insights. It's got a great analytics engine behind it. I'm going to hire a security operations team, and they're going to be hunting for all these things. That's awesome. But they're not focused on internal security because the revenue doesn't allow, let's be honest, the revenue, they're still trying to grow into that. And to hire somebody like an Adam Evans to come in is not going to be cheap.
Right.
And also that Adam Evans is going to come in and say, well, we've got to do some assessment over here. And you've never done an asset inventory over there. And your beginnings on CIS controls have never, like, all the stuff we security vendors are preaching oftentimes are not the things that are being practiced internally. Now, again, not speaking of any particular vendor, but that seems to be kind of where many of them are at. And so that's a problem in and of itself. And I do think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I'm curious what you think about it, Bobby. Like, on one hand, the vendor's got to grow and make money. On the other hand, how do you do this and put the right attention into what kind of data you have and how you process it? If you have to have both as a balance as you're coming in. And I think a lot of vendors are probably reaping the unfortunate rewards of pursuing revenue too fast, too quickly, and then they haven't had the back end stuff, and now they're in rush to go solve for it. I'm just speaking honestly.
Well, I think if we back up for just a second, CMMC, kind of the reason why that program existed is because of the lack of follow through, even being required by contract for the primes and subprime organizations that are participating. So for those of you who may not be aware, right, these organizations, it might be a manufacturing company, we're making bolts and those types of things. They may participate in a contract, and in the contract it says you have to be doing these types of security things. And when the IG came in and did their audit of lots and lots of different organizations, they found that they weren't doing it. They weren't doing the controls that are required security wise. And they got very upset, and the DoD kind of took their toys and left and said, all right, guys, we're back now, and we're back with CMMC, and this is how it's going to have to go down. And it's funny, you are almost parroting the same problem in the vendor industry. But I want to ask Adam, do you feel as MSPs that we have the same problem?
Oh, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, we need to continue to grow our revenue as an MSP so we can keep growing, expanding, etc. We look at our internal infrastructures, and it's always that list of I'll deal with it later problems. And now we're throwing a complex compliance posture like CMMC on top of it that might not align with our security goals and saying you have to do this now. Great example. CMMC says you need to encrypt your backups. It doesn't say you need to have the backups, but if you have them, you have to encrypt them. And we as MSPs look at that and go, well, yeah, you need backups. I don't care if it's this weird FIPSy module encryption stuff over here. I'm going to have good backups, and the vendor says it's secure. Moving on to the next problem. So it's kind of this double-edged sword and this, almost circling the drain of just everyone's looking at the issues and going, we can handle it this way, we can handle it this way, we can handle it this way. But the government's saying, no, here's the way we want it handled. And we're like, okay. So it just creates a big compounding problem if we let it go too far.
Well, I think what you're starting to see is the string that everybody's pulling on here is profitability of those respective organizations. And a lot of times security is what gets thrown by, out the window to save cost. And, Wes, I think you hit it. And same for you, Adam, nail on the head, the challenge that's running into. And when you look at the CMMC program, it's going to force your hand. It is going to make you have to address these realities. And the cobbler is going to now have decent shoes, if not good shoes, once all said and done, because they have no choice. They're going to have to do those controls, and you're going to be audited. No pinky swearing is going to be involved in that process. How do you feel when people are going to be held accountable in the CMMC ecosystem? Do you feel, Wes, that that's a reason why vendors may run, because they're going to be held accountable to that standard? I know MSPs, speaking from my perspective, are, but do you see that same challenge for vendors?
I've seen the same. I've talked to MSPs that have said, we're just done with CMMC. If we have a client that needs it, we're going to refer it over to someone else and, make some margins on the referral and do what we do best. I'm like, you know what? Good for you. Like, good for you to say, maybe that's just not in our ICP, our ideal client profile, and we're not going to pursue that. And we can come back to it later if we want to. I remember in the old days when just security as a whole was coming into the market, and I talked to an MSP that initially worked with a lot of banks, fired them all. Actually, some of the banks fired them. And they came back to the wheelhouse and said, you know what? I actually think we made a mistake. Let's go dive deep into security and understand governance and understand banks. And now they actually have more banks than before, and they're way more profitable. But my point is, there has to be, especially the vendors themselves, the economy has to, I'm no economist, but there has to be if there's misalignment on the requirements that have to exist, there's going to be misalignment on price expectations. And so take that MSP, for example. Initially, they're like, we're looking at the cost of doing business with all these banks, and we're actually losing money. So they fired them, and they got fired. They came back to the drawing board and they said, wait a second. The banks are saying, well, we need a vendor like an MSP that can help us. And maybe now that we're without them, we're actually less able and less profitable and less capable because we don't have the staff ourselves. So maybe we do have to pay more for this. And the MSP came back to the drawing board and said, actually, we're actually excited to work with you. We've done our homework. Now, because we've done our homework, we're a lot more mature. We're a lot more process savvy. We've built a lot more controls in place. It's more expensive to work with us. Yeah. Now we have alignment. We saw the same thing in cybersecurity insurance. Clients like, I'm not doing any of this stuff. No way. And then all of a sudden, insurance forces their hand to do something. And they're like, well, darn it, I guess we have to do this to keep this contract.
Right.
But then they learn how to normalize themselves, and they go back to their clients and say, this is going to cost more because we're doing more. And so I think CMMC is a good example of that. Just to pick on one thing, take FedRAMP, for example. An MSP comes and says, well, I think you need to have FedRAMP. The MSP or the vendor goes, okay, well, look at that. They go talk to their DevOps guys, and the DevOps guys say, yeah, we can move into AWS FedRAMP, but it's going to be 8 times the cost.
Yeah.
Because we've got to separate infrastructure. We got to move everything in, which is just operationally more expensive because it's FedRAMP. So you go back to the client and say, are you okay with spending 8 times more with us? And now the MSP says, well, I don't know. Let me go ask the client. The client says, heck no. So we're still in that misalignment of even price expectations. I don't know why no one talks about this. But those are things that I think the hand is going to have to be forced. And then we see renormalization of price expectations. Right. And then we see adoption as a whole. And I think the teeth of regulation in every instance are usually what's required to make that happen, to all of a sudden force the price expectation normalization, which then forces the vendors and the clients to doing the right thing.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And I wanted to actually double down on that just from what I've seen in my own experience. The defense industry in the U.S. is one of the biggest industries out there, I think, next to pharmaceutical. Obviously, we've got our big companies, Lockheed, Boeing, etc. But you've got all those small businesses making those lug nuts, those wheels, those screws to go into the fancy fighter jets. That's a huge market out there. And yes, while those mom and pop shops that are making those parts have to get brought into these compliance postures, they have to spend the money. That's a huge economical boom for those companies as they're looking at the price they have to spend. They can bake it into their margins. They can increase their overall costs. They can bring more money into the company, and it works out in the end. Lord knows the government has no issues writing those big checks all the time. So us as the MSP in that middle ground, being able to bring those solutions in, that's a win for us. It's a win for the client. And at the end of the day, it's the win for our defense posture as a nation.
Yeah. So for us, one of the challenges that we have seen is it is a ghost town trying to find vendors that understand kind of like what you're talking about, Wes, and then let alone being able to share and feel comfortable communicating. And I think one of the misnomers that we see is that maybe MSPs go, are you CMMC certified? Well, if you're having that conversation with a vendor, you probably don't know what you're talking about because you can't know what's got certifications yet. The starter pistol hasn't even gone off officially yet. So the reality is, I think what vendors need to have is transparency so that someone like ourselves that are participating in the CMMC ecosystem and looking for vendors, if the vendor can just be transparent about their posture and what type of data they're taking, then we as someone that potentially wants to do business with them can say, okay, here's a piece of paper that says exactly how that product is operating, what type of data, and where they're storing it. And if the answers make me feel comfortable and I want to include that in what I'm trying to do for CMMC, then I could present that as part of my solution when I get audited to my auditor. Can you talk about that, Wes, and the challenges that vendors are even now facing about having transparency about those types of things?
I can, and I'd love to. And I'm actually put on my Adam Evans hat a little bit on this one too, from an MSP perspective. So I remember in my days at Perch, when we were going through GDPR, we started to pick up a whole bunch of EU clients. And before we really started seeing traction, like, well, where are you at with GDPR? I'm like, well, we're nowhere. We got to work on this. So I talked to our attorneys and we begin to understand, what does a data processing agreement look like? What does Privacy Shield look like? And what kind of documentation and internal things do we have to have done on our own? And actually what I learned out of that was some really healthy things that, let's be honest, we should have been doing from the beginning. One of those that the attorney told me was like, you need to understand all the kinds of data that you bring in at Perch and all the kinds of data you can bring in. And then once you understand what that looks like and what it is, then you can start to discuss and understand, how do we store it? How do we process it? How long does it stay in place? What are the rights and capabilities you have internally on removing certain data upon request? What do those processes look like? On and on and on. And that was actually really beneficial to us. And one of the things I think is so beneficial to that as a vendor is, by the way, all this comes back to CIS Control 2, right? Control 2 is inventory of your data assets. And that includes the actual types of data entities that you entertain. So if I put on my Adam Evans hat on for a minute, I think it's great for an MSP to say, wait a second, so you don't have some kind of data processing document of some kind that you can send me that tells you the kinds of data you store from us? What? I'm not asking a CMMC question. I'm not asking a NIST 171 question. I'm asking a generalist, basic security guideline question. And if you don't have it, can we work on getting one together in the next 2 to 3 months? Because I think it'll be helpful for you, and I know it'll be helpful for us, and it'll be helpful for when CMMC finally does have force, you actually understand these things.
Right.
So that's how I would do it. I would jump right in from that perspective and say, why would you not do a CIS Control 2 type of approach to something like this? It's immensely valuable.
Would you say that that's a recommendation that you would have just vendors if maybe they're not sure, 100%. They're on the fence? Okay.
100. Yeah. Why would you not do that? If you as a vendor don't know, we've said this over and over in security, right? The basis of controls 1 and 2 to any client is, if you don't know what you have, you can't protect it. We've said that over and over. Everyone knows that. Vendors, same thing. If you don't know the kinds of data you're pulling in, good luck building the right controls around it. You can't give me any confidence that you have the capability of secure something you've never assessed before. Right now, we can throw out edge cases. Like I was talking to some RPA folks recently, like, well, theoretically, you could throw through that API anything into our platform that we had no idea about. It's not our fault, it's yours. Totally get that, right? So you should be sort of a response back to the client saying, your job is to assess as an ingestion engine. We can actually take anything in this format. So your job is to assess your data inventory and understand what you're sending us to. Like, this is a two-way street.
True.
But man, those conversations are healthy. And yes, every vendor needs to be doing that. Even if you're a basic vendor that you think, well, we're just doing this one tiny little thing. Well, it's still helpful to know what kind of data you have from your client, because when stuff hits the fan, you probably want to know what all you have and what the scope is and how long you've had it and where you're storing it and how you're storing it, and on and on and on.
So Adam, I want to ask you a question. I know I interrupt you. I apologize, but I really want to know, like, what's been your experience about the conversations? Because you've been spearheading a lot of the conversations for us with our vendors. Like, what's the percentage of transparency that you feel is at a level it needs to be when you're talking with vendors?
I think there's still quite a bit of work to be done. I've had some great conversations with some vendors that have been completely transparent. This is exactly what we collect, how we use it, what we do with it, how long we retain it, and the focus of CMMC, saying whether they are or are not moving down that road. And other vendors that'll just keep reiterating, well, we have a SOC 2. We have a SOC 2. We have a SOC 2. And then you look at the scope of that SOC 2, and it doesn't address it at all.
Yeah.
It's really hit and miss. Or the other side of the coin of you have to go digging through their own KBs to find it, that when you question them on it, they don't know.
Right.
Or you've got in some instances, your sales reps that are like, oh, everything's fine, it's peachy, everything's going to be great, don't worry about it. And it's like, no, I do need to worry about that. Like, I understand as a vendor, you don't want to get compromised, but it happens. Any organization can have a security incident. And I need to think about that as I look at adopting a solution for myself or bringing it into a client environment, because who knows who's going to ask the same question, whether it's an auditor, an insurance company, or in a worst case scenario, the person doing instant response after it hits the fan.
So I think sometimes what vendors perhaps don't understand. So I'm going to throw some things out here and you guys say, yes, I agree with, or thumbs down. All right. So what if a vendor talked about how their product aligns with a framework like CIS or CMMC, like NIST, 800-171A, or the NIST NSF. Like, if they went and just created a matrix about how their product aligns with it and how they address some of those things, do you think that would be good? Do you think that would be a worth effort?
Absolutely, it would be good. But the one thing I would add to the vendor to say is it's not just about what you do and how you help the client. It's also about what you do yourself to protect yourself, right? So like, I would just say, don't forget that. You could be the world's greatest privilege access management vendor and do no privilege yourself internally.
Yeah.
Right. So like,
so true.
Show us not just what you do, but operationally how you do what you do internally as well for your own governance.
And how do vendors share that without sharing too much? They get very nervous about sharing SOC information. They make you sign all these NDAs, and they, say if you share it with anyone, we'll come and, steal your children out of their, car. I mean, it's like they get really pretty nervous about stuff like that. And I think this kind of information potentially could even be more sensitive for them. I mean, how do they share that? And provide that level of confidence that the cobbler does have good shoes, that they're not cutting corners.
I'll start, but Adam, I want to know what you think here too. I've done tons of like third-party risk management in my banking days and also even at Perch and in other places. And so a couple of things in place, like there has to be some stuff that's post NDA, and that makes sense, but it doesn't necessarily have to be post like contract signing. You can do some of this in what we call due diligence with the vendor, right? And so I'll just tell a vendor, look, I'm sorry, if you think you can't, let's say you have a data processing agreement that describes and defines all the data entities that you have and how you store them, how long you store them, what the process is for getting rid of them, all this stuff around confidentiality and privacy. And you won't share that with me because you think that's secret sauce? Come on. Like, that's not secret sauce. Anyone can go collect that same kind of data. What you do with it may be secret sauce. I totally understand if a vendor comes back and says, look, we got an algorithm that we do some things that we can't talk about because it's really who we are and what we do. But the outcome, I can talk to you about the outcome, and I can talk to you about the data processing, the data flow diagrams. I can talk to you about the platforms that are involved, like the systems that we use. I think that's totally fine, right? Like, just to use a perch example, since I come out of that, like, there's nothing wrong with you saying I have like some kind of like agent that consumes something, and then there's some kind of zero MQ kind of thing that it ingests it, and then it goes off to a data pipeline in Amazon that's stored by Kafka, and then Kafka produces and sends it over to Elastic. Like, share that stuff with people, share the kinds of data. None of that secret sauce, none of it. You got to learn how to be transparent enough where you're not giving away the keys to the kingdom. You certainly you owe it to the client,
right,
to tell them the kind of custodial duties that you're doing for them. You owe it to them. And so just don't think about that being like confidential, because it's really not. And
right.
If you have to hide that behind an NDA, totally understand that. Go do that. That makes sense. But stop. To me, I'm just going to say, if you're not going to share it, it's probably because you don't have it. That's how I'm going to knee jerk and think.
Yeah, that definitely would make you concerned about that. Yeah. Adam, what's your thoughts?
I'd say to that point, you're absolutely right. I don't need the secret sauce. I just need to know that you have a secret sauce. So if we look at like the software development lifecycle, I want to make sure that you're doing your due diligence in the software development process to make sure that you're looking for those common vulnerabilities, you're addressing them, and you're doing some basic testing. I don't need to know exactly how you do that. If you're going to be fully going through some fancy OWASP stack to make sure that all those things are taken care of, whether you outsource to white box, black box, I don't care. I just need to know that it was done and that you do it on a regular basis. And when you do detect something, you will fix it in a defined period of time. That's all I need to know.
Yeah.
That's not secret sauce by any means. That's just doing your basic job as a software dev. I understand small vendors might not have the capacity to do that in that depth. But just admit it. Just say, hey, we're still pretty small. You look at some of the new small vendors that are popping up at IT Nation Connects. If their answer is, we don't have the capacity for it yet, that's fine. I can make a risk decision based on that, though.
And Adam, you know what I love about that?
Mm-hmm.
You just came to me as a vendor with a very reasonable approach to this. You didn't come to me and say, well, you got to have a $25,000 to $40,000 SOC 2 or else. And you just said earlier, well, I can scope out of anything that I want to hide from it, right? SOC 2s are great, but like, sure, I can hide things. You came to me with a very specific set of things that I think is digestible and doable for just about any vendor that's out there, independent of them having some super expensive third-party application, AppSec test plus a, SOC, blah, blah, blah. Like, I love that approach. And I think that's something that vendors can and should be doing. And I think I'd love to see you guys do a podcast from an like here as an MSP. Here are the things you actually should be asking, independent of CMMC, independent of financial, independent of who the industry is. Like, those are things I want to know too. And I think if we could standardize around a lot of that and be transparent to what Adam just said, we would do our industry a whole lot better.
Oh, for sure.
To that point, if I go out and have a huge list of vendor due diligence questions out there, I'm just asking the question because I'm just looking for an answer. If the vendor says, no, we don't have all this stuff, that's perfectly fine. But I need to make risk-based decisions, and I need that information to make that decision. If the vendor's going to tell me, don't worry about it, you can't ask that, sign the NDA after you sign the agreement with us and we'll share, I can't make a good decision off that.
Right.
Even if it's, like the secure development lifecycle, if the answer is no, we don't have that, that's fine. I can still make my decisions appropriately. And if it's too high of a risk, I can say, sorry, come back when you have it. Or if it's low impact data, this isn't going to be a problem, but when's it going to be on your roadmap? When can we discuss this in further depth? It's all about the decision-making process.
It's last thing I'll say quickly. It is so refreshing to hear that, Adam, because I've dealt with a whole bunch of clients and a whole bunch of vendors that want to ramrod a hard-coded process of you must have a SOC 2 and you must have this and you must have this, otherwise you're not doing business. And I'm like, are you actually doing yourself more damage by forcing a rigorous process in versus a true risk-aligned approach that's independent of like the specific outcomes, like a SOC 2 in place? Like, man, Adam, I love how you say that. I wish more people would think the way you think.
I appreciate that.
I think what that does too is it puts the power in the choice. It puts the power because now we can see more and have appropriate decisions. And the vendor doesn't have to make promises other than what they shared is true. They don't have to say, I am 100% this, I complete all of these control. You don't have to say that. All you have to do is just be transparent, share how you guys are operating, do it. Let the people that are trying to pick the products have the information so they can appropriately pick it. If they don't have the experience to pick the right product, and they're waiting on you telling them that you guarantee that product can do all of these things, then they maybe shouldn't be picking products in the first place. You need to really have kind of like what Adam's saying is that risk decision where you're looking at it. And that's a much more mature way of looking at it because, CMMC and most things in general, they're not a technology solution. They're just tools. And people are what's going to be the solution. It's the people that are putting those tools in the right spots and tuning them the right way. And they have to look at a holistic way of doing those types of things. And if you empower them by saying, okay, here's a matrix of how we operate and solve, how we address those, but internally, this is how we do it as well. And here's the data we're collecting and here's where we're putting it. That just opens a world of possibilities of making the right choices. And oh man, that would be so refreshing if most of the vendors did that. And that's something that they could do right now, right? They don't have to necessarily try to chase CMMC. They could just do that. I mean, what's your thoughts about that?
You nailed it. Like, to me, again, I hope vendors are listening to this, and I hope vendors come away with the literal exact opposite of what your fear has been for all these years of, I have to do these stupid, expensive things, and I have to go get my CMMC level 2, and I don't even know what that means, and I'm scared by the terms, how we intro this podcast into, wait, I can do that. I'm excited about doing that. I can't wait to actually bring some transparency in the process, not just for our clients, but for ourselves. And I don't actually think it's that hard. I can sit down with some of my DevOps folks. I can sit down with some of our, probably that's about the majority of it. Some engineering folks, if you haven't, depending on the complexity and size of your vendor, very quickly ascertain some of these things, what I have, what I do with it, what the data flows are. That's the same thing that we've been preaching to MSPs and their clients. Do the same thing with your clients. You can do this for yourself. So stop preaching and start practicing.
Yeah,
absolutely. To me, I get encouraged by this, and you've just given me a very practical can do. Anyone can go find it and create a data processing agreement and build some of those things into it. And it's one of the most valuable things that I think you can do.
So let's get more specific. Let's get more into the weeds of things that I think also create some fear. And that's about the types of data that as a vendor you may be collecting. And a lot of that is anchored to decisions that could force you into having to be FedRAMP if you wanted to participate in the CMMC ecosystem. That's a lot. I mean, there's just no way we could unpack all of that in a 30-minute conversation. But I just wanted to kind of throw that out there and say, okay, is there a little piece that you want to maybe nibble on and talk about around that category of fear of that type of data and what may force you as a vendor to have to do?
Sure. I want to be careful not to overstep my bounds. As we said from the beginning, I'm not an expert in CMMC. I haven't, spent enough time on that myself. I've been a cybersecurity expert, my whole career. So the overlap kind of exists. But I think what I want to start with is there may be some inertia and there may be some things that you've done as just business practice for the longest time that you've been maybe collecting things that you don't need to be collecting. Maybe you've approached it from maybe your ingestion engine where you suck in these certain things to do this stuff from a client perspective. You just take in everything, but you come back and look and say, well, actually, we don't need all of that. Or maybe you're an RMM vendor, right? And you have full controls to just let anybody into the system and your agent touches every tiny little piece of the endpoint. You're like, wait a second. I know we did that in the early days because it was just easy. But we could actually fine-grain hard control and lock ourselves out of a whole bunch of things that we might not need. That's a worthy conversation. What does this come back to? It doesn't come back to CMMC. It comes back to one of the basic tenets of security, which is minimum principle of least privilege. Right. What's the minimum access that I need to do my job? So you see how this all comes back full circle? The truth of CMMC is sometimes I feel like the way it's couched is all this new stuff that no one's done before. But when I think about it from a confidentiality and an integrity perspective in particular, this goes back to 1980s basic cybersecurity fundamentals. And I just think we owe it to ourselves to say, well, let's let CMMC push us into reassessing and rethinking some of those things from a minimum perspective. And so to me, that's what stands out to me with that question, Bobby, is like, that's what I would want to be doing. And that's what I think the benefit should be coming in. We shouldn't have this situation where, our, SolarWinds style, all of a sudden our, certificate authority gets popped and literally all hell breaks loose from there. Like, why is it happening today's day and age? Probably because we've had years and years and years of tech debt and just inertia that we haven't gotten past from the old way of doing things that need to be fixed.
Well, and I think I think the DoD knows that, and the assessors in there know that, and that's why they're attaching these requirements to data, because they want to get the push not just to us as an MSP, but they want to know the tools that we're using are also going to be held to certain standards, because that risk, like SolarWinds you just described, is a perfect example of how they might have contacted another vendor, like maybe an MSP, who then helped them get SolarWinds installed. But it's like that person let them in the door, and it's the tool that they were using that kicked the door open and created that data breach. And so I think that's absolutely true. If we can start looking at that and seeing how we can do that, I think a lot more vendors would just naturally align in a lot of ways, and it wouldn't be anywhere as much of a transition for them if they wanted to try to be more actively involved in the system. What were you going to say, Adam?
I was just going to mention, just another common thing that I've seen from vendors out there that's just an older practice that can go away. How many different software platforms say, can you add an allow list entry in your antivirus for us, for our RMM or for these tools there? But we've seen how dangerous that can be and how that's not a good practice anymore.
Right.
In previous gigs and whatnot, I didn't do that unless there was a problem. And most times it didn't even cause an issue. No one noticed. But of course, if that RMM agent or that other tool starts going haywire, my AV is looking at that. It's a simple little thing, but you still see it time and again from, RMM vendor A and B and C saying, allow this in your AV. It's just a simple practice that can go away without causing too much headache.
And I think vendors also could reach out to a certified C3PAO organization that has gone through their DIBCAC assessment. They understand, they know what the ecosystem is, and these vendors can engage these organizations to have a trusted person to consult with, to kind of give them some guidance. They don't have to make all the changes. They can just kind of tap into having a better understanding of, okay, well, if we make these 30% improvements, kind of like what you're talking about, Wes, that'll get us much closer. And we're on the field of play to, if we want to make a run at it more serious, we can. And if we don't, we're still doing things that we should be doing anyway, right?
Yeah. And what if you could make the argument of, what if I could make some material changes that both increase the privacy capabilities of ourselves and our clients we do business with by actually taking in a whole lot less types of data because we don't really need it. And now we actually save a whole bunch of money because maybe in theory we don't have to go into like FedRAMP. I mean, I don't know. It's all hypotheticals, but like,
right.
You owe it to yourself to know what you don't know. And I don't think, I'll come back. We're going to beat this dead horse, but I think we have to, because a horse ain't dead enough. It's like, if you haven't assessed yourself, you don't understand what kind of data you have and what you're pulling in. Like, that's literally all this comes back to it. That's why it's step one here. It really, to me, is. And at least from there, you have the perspective and the knowledge. You can go to your senior management team, your product dev team, and say, what does the next 3 years look like from a roadmap perspective? Do we have to approach CMMC? Is it going to become something that's we're going to have to address between us and our MSPs and our clients? Like, stop putting your head in the sand and start figuring out at least where you stand and what you should and shouldn't be doing.
Right.
So you can at least know the pathway forward instead of just, putting down. I understand putting down the foot and saying, well, I'm not moving until I know what this means for us. And I'm not going to spend all this money on something that's an unknown quantity. At least figure this out and have some of those conversations like you mentioned with a qualified C3PAO. I guess they're all qualified. They're C3PAO, but go have those conversations so you understand kind of where you stand and assess yourself to understand what that roadmap is.
Yeah.
Well, and I like that point that you mentioned there too, because from the MSP perspective, that again allows me to have those conversations to better understand my risk. A vendor may not be, aligned with CMMC. They may not be aligned with FedRAMP, but if they can have that transparent conversation with me, I can make those risk responses. I can decide, okay, vendor ABC is going to be 24 months out from their FedRAMP process. Great. I also have a lot of work to do myself. Can I bring that vendor on board knowing that I'm maybe 36 months out from needing my assessment done? Can I make those decisions now and, instead of having to go back to the drawing board, or is that going to be a deal breaker? For some MSPs, yeah, it's going to be that deal breaker. The timelines aren't going to line up. It's going to be a problem. For other ones, you've made a risk-based decision. You've had the conversation. You had all the information you need to make those calls. And if you're in that middle ground, you might be able to argue your way out of that. You could say, I put compensating controls 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in place. I've added these processes and procedures to it. And you can take that to an assessor and say, yeah, I know this isn't there, but here's everything I did to limit that data flow or to limit that access or to limit that function.
So Adam, I want to ask you, man, we don't have a lot of time, but I do want to cover this because I think it's really critical for any vendor or someone who's considering picking a vendor. What are 2 types of critical data that if you're picking a solution that you want to be very cautious about? And as a vendor, you want to be, like what Wes is saying, aware that you potentially could be ingesting that type of data. Can you kind of go through those data types that are going to drive you in whether you're going to have to get level 2 certified as a vendor or whether or not you're going to have to get FedRAMP? I think that would be probably helpful.
Yeah. In the scope of CMMC, and I'll actually throw a third category in there because it does hit for level 1. I'm looking for that contract information, that FCI.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also looking for that controlled unclassified information, and then I'm looking for that security protection data. If I start seeing those 3 data types going into a vendor tool set, the amount of questions I have is going to go up.
Yeah.
If it's just the FCI, okay, that's usually in scope for your level 1. I still care about that. I want to make sure it's secured appropriately. If it's CUI and it's going to a cloud location, okay, we've got to have conversations, and FedRAMP starts coming up an awful lot. Yeah. But if it's security protection data, what and how and why and what other stuff's in place? Can I get out of that FedRAMP requirement? Or do I have to stick with it? There's a lot of questions that can be asked at that point, but it's those 3 main data types that I'm looking at, and I start getting really concerned when I start seeing a vendor tool grabbing log data and pulling that over, or a lot of AVs love to do that sample file collection. If they grab a macro-laden spreadsheet, because Lord knows Lockheed Martin and all the primes out there still love their macros and their spreadsheets for their calculations, if that gets pulled into Sentinel-1 or Windows Defender, could they have just pulled, CUI into that scope? Again, questions.
Mm-hmm. Adam, can you, for my own benefit, and I think the vendors that may be listening to this, I don't even think you mentioned a little bit about those categories, but and I know you can't be exhaustive here, but can you give just for each of those 3 categories a couple examples of what that kind of data might be?
Yeah. So your federal contract info, your FCI, just that simple, RFP could be scoped in on that. Or here's the invoice from Lockheed to Johnny's lug nut shop for those lug nuts.
Right. Contract information, things like that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Your security protection data. Those would be your logs, your antivirus logs.
SIM data that is collecting vulnerability scans that have critical things that you're supposed to address. Those would definitely be security protection.
Yep. And your CUI, your CUI, there's so many different CUI categories out there, but a simple example of it out there. The machine schematics for that bolt that Johnny's lug nut shop was contracted to make. It might not be, you don't find out that it's going in the F-22 or anything like that, but it's a government part that they bought that's sensitive.
And they'll have labels on them. They're supposed to be labeled appropriately. So there's a whole thing about that. So in theory, you should not be taking any of that type of data without you knowing it because of the way it's supposed to be labeled. Does that mean that's how it's always happening? No, sadly it's not. And that's a big issue. And I think it all goes back to trying to understand, kind of like what you're talking about, Wes, is that's just a very big primer, but you could talk with a C3PO as a vendor and just have a better understanding of what that type of data is. So you can say, okay, well, I think we have exposure to these types of things. What are some mitigating controls that we could put in place? You don't necessarily even have to completely expunge it. You could say, you know what? Let's allow them the ability, and like an EDR is a perfect example, to turn off sandboxing. So, you're not going to have the possibility of ingesting that data. Now, is that an argument? Could be that you're making things less secure. And that's a whole other podcast right there. But if you enable that type of possibility for them, then they can start doing things without making major changes to your product to allow them to be compliant. And here's the other cool thing is they could still use your product in a non-CMMC environment, and they won't necessarily have to have those turned on because they're not required, right? So they could still use your product all over instead of just in a niche kind of situation. So I think allowing people with those options would be so much more, opening your mind to,
Sure would.
to more possibilities.
And then if we come back and we say, let's just pull that thread a little further. What if we come back and we say, well, we have to have sandboxing on? It's really critical. Well, now I guess we say, well, then what do we do? Like maybe that's where FedRAMP comes involved, and all of a sudden that has to go land inside FedRAMP, like a FedRAMP data center where the sandboxing and the analysis is done. Would that be sort of like following that thread a little further? Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and I can take that a step further. We look at export controlled information under ITAR, because you can see those two kind of lining up fairly often. Okay, you've got it in your AWS GovCloud, and the only people on your team that can look into that are authorized U.S. personnel, and you can prove that. But you tell me to do that, you're going to have to charge me 10 times what I currently pay. If that's my only option and it's the best fit because you've got the best product, I look at that and go, cool, I can make my business case to my client to say, sorry, your AV costs 10 times more now because you're going down this road. Here's what you get for it, and it's not going to be a risk to your compliance posture. Done.
So I think the important thing that I hope for vendors as well as organizations that are considering seeking vendors is transparency, just really trying to be transparent, but also as well as provide options that could help you exclude types of data and understand the types of data that your product is consuming. And you don't, if you work things the right way, you may possibly be able to dodge a lot of the challenges of having to be FedRAMP if you gave those types of possibilities, right? And that would be a huge deal. And as someone who's an MSP who is kind of walking the desert because there's not a lot of vendors in there, there are a lot of MSPs that are going to start stepping into this ecosystem and are going to need vendors to partner with. And I think what you I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, Wes, it's going to make your product better as you try to align with that anyway, because I know it's done that for us as an MSP.
And it's what we're doing is we're unifying the language here. And that's why I love what you're doing, Bobby and Adam, on this podcast, is you're helping us set the not set the standards, you're helping communicate what the standards are. Right. And you're helping, because I think the more vendors hear a unified language coming back from their clients of this is what you need to do, this is what we expect, this is what we need, they will begin to move. They will listen. They do care because they need to make money themselves. And so when they hear a unified language coming back, and right now I just don't think we're there. I hear way too much this and that and this and that from MSPs, and even from some of the, CMMC thought leaders that are out there. Again, I have no specific person in mind, but until we have unified language on exactly what this looks like, and even better clarity from DoD and others, we're getting there. But that's what we've needed to really help us push forward. Was once we have a unified clarity of language, then I think it becomes easier for us to say, okay, now I understand what I've got to do. I got my marching orders. But it's just hard for vendors, coming full circle. It's hard for vendors to say, you're asking me to spend a whole bunch of time and money on something that I don't even know if this is a problem. And that's the problem that I think needs to be fixed. And I love that you guys are making that a mission. And I think the vendors will listen to this, and I think they will care. So this is an awesome, awesome podcast for that purpose.
Thank you, Wes. And I really appreciate you coming on and joining with us. And I hope that for you vendors that have been tuning in and watching, or if you're selecting a vendor, there's a lot of things you can do right now. You can be doing things right now. You don't have to climb the whole mountain. You can set base camp at the at the base and start kind of working your way a little bit up there, and you will be better for it. And I think we used a lot of examples of things that as MSPs we could be doing, as vendors you could be doing, that would definitely make you better as an organization and would help you get further down your journey. And that if or when you decide you really want to go full on, it's not like you're starting from scratch. And I think we can all agree that's better for everybody as well as the community.
Make sure to follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube to stay up to date on the latest CMMC news. We hope you guys enjoyed today's episode and listen out for the next one. But until then, keep on climbing.